the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, episode 79.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you on today's episode where we get into an interesting discussion about Russia. Yeah, plenty of Russian news as far as our country is concerned over here in the U.S., but this is a different angle on it. It basically is saying that there is a way that the U.S. could use energy to protect itself from Russian interest. And so we have on Jonathan Morgenstein to talk to us about that today, and he is the founding president and CEO of Empowerment Solar. We will link to all of his information in the show notes. He also mentions that he will be speaking at a conference. We will link to that as well, so you can go and check him out if you're in Vegas on September 11th. Question of the day. Are you concerned that Europe buys so much of its energy, oil, gas, etc., from Russia? Does that concern you? Ryan at globalenergymedia.com. That's Ryan at globalenergymedia.com. Without further ado, Jonathan Morgenstein. Well, Jonathan, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today. How are you doing?
Doing fine. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, I just got to ask, you're in Germany right now, and we're recording this on August the 14th, and so it's hot over here in the great state of Texas. What's the weather like in Germany?
Well, in southern Germany, it's actually quite cool. It was drizzly a little bit over the weekend, and got up probably into the 70s today. But actually, southern Germany is quite beautiful in terms of weather for my taste.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to talk about the Apollo's Shield today. Before we get into the ins and outs of it, can you just kind of break down what that term is? What does that mean when we throw out the term Apollo Shield?
Yes. The idea is that, we can use the sun basically to defend the United States and our Western allies. And so when there is a threat, as there is significantly from Russia right now, and we have the opportunity to use a tool that hasn't been really thought of as a weapon or a defense much in the past, which is the power of the sun in the form of solar, electricity in the form of other renewables, other clean energy mechanisms such as wind and geothermal and I guess sources of energy such as this.
Okay, and it's interesting that you say the sun. You don't really think of the sun as kind of a strategic thing, but what would be the advantage for the U.S. standpoint to having the sun compared to other nations that might not be in our interest?
Well, it all boils down to the fact that Russia as a threat to the West has been growing to a very high-profile degree in the last few years. I mean, they've dumped millions into trying to sabotage elections across Europe. They're trying to do it now in Germany, France, the Netherlands. There's indications that they helped secure a win for the Brexit. They obviously interfered in American elections. They've tried to assassinate a pro-NATO prime minister in Montenegro. Just this summer, they threatened to literally eliminate Sweden. That was the word Vladimir Putin used to talk about Sweden if Sweden thought about joining NATO. This is after Sweden declared they weren't going to join NATO. And don't take my word for it. Both Secretary of Defense Mattis has called them the largest threat to us in the world, and Vice President Pence in July said that no threat looms larger in the Baltic states than the specter of aggression from Russia. And the thing, though, is that Russia is in a very, very precarious place because they are extraordinarily dependent on their ability to sell fossil fuels to Europe and North America. Literally, over 35% of every ruble in the Russian government's budget comes from selling fossil fuels to Europe and North America. So if we and Europe, if we helped Europe to transition away from fossil fuel dependency, we literally could suffocate Russia's ability to wreak havoc in the United States and across Europe and across the world.
Yeah, I don't think when we think about Russia and their impact from a geopolitical standpoint, we really realize, as you're pointing out there, some of the trade agreements that they have with European nations, and how it kind of puts European nations in a bad spot because they're getting energy from Russia, and so if they're going to come out and they're going to be hard on Russians, or they're going to look for sanctions, they're kind of in a bad spot because Russia theoretically could turn their lights out.
Absolutely. So combined in 2015. Russia was the source of 34% of all European Union oil and gas. They're the number one source of oil and gas for all of Europe. And so they use that leverage to threaten Europe constantly. When Russia invaded Ukraine a few years ago and Europe tried to push back, Russia started squeezing them. And probably we were able to impose sanctions, but probably not as strongly as we would have liked, specifically because of this kind of this grip that Russia has on Europe. But again, what many people don't realize is that this is actually a two-way issue, and that Europe actually has the stronger position because Russia can't cut off. They literally can't cut off Europe without collapsing. 70% of all Russian exports are oil and gas, and 80% of Russian natural gas exports go to Europe. 61% of Russian oil exports go to Europe. That's all from BP, the oil company. So these numbers show that if Russia was no longer able to sell their fuels to Europe because Europe instead was buying American-made or European-made or even Chinese-made solar panels, wind turbines, and other clean energy technology, then not only would Russia not have this revenue, I mean, tens of billions of dollars that they need to fund their security apparatus, but the price of the oil and gas that they were even continually able to sell to others would be worth less to them. They would be getting less for every, for every gallon, every barrel of oil they were able to sell. That barrel would cost less, and so they would get less money.
Right. Well, I guess the immediate question that comes to mind for me, at least, is, okay, if European nations want to put the squeeze on Russia right now, they could start buying oil and gas from the U.S. or other nations, and that would begin to put the squeeze on Russia while we look towards maybe rolling out some of these green initiatives that you're talking about here. What's keeping that from happening?
Well, Europe is. Europe has been collectively now, and part of the thing that we have to remember is that Europe isn't like the United States, where yes, there's 50 states, but there's one federal government. I mean, there's European Union, which promotes policies and can kind of get some policies moving forward, but each country does have an extraordinary more amount of independence than the 50 United States. But nonetheless, they've been advancing significantly in their clean energy drive, but not enough. I mean, 11 European countries are dependent on Russia for 90% of their natural gas. And the thing about natural gas is you can only really get it in two forms. You either get it through a pipeline or you have to get it in the form of liquid natural gas. And yes, the Europeans can and are starting to buy more from the United States. But there's limits to how much we can produce right now. We only started exporting liquid natural gas in the last few years. And LNG can really only be a short-term solution for this. I mean, it would have to be cost competitive on a liter by liter basis with Russian LNG. But if instead we move towards the renewable solution, that's a permanent solution. A year from now, if the price of Russian gas dips below the price of American LNG, then of course, then they're going to go back to buying Russian gas. But I mean, if we install mega fields of wind turbines and and solar panels, I mean, they're just not going to be able to compete, and it'll already be in the ground. There's nothing the Russians can do. No one's going to buy a liter of liquid natural gas or whatever of any sort of gas if they already have the generation right there, and the inputs cost nothing more.
Okay, so I understand from an oil and gas standpoint, how those trade agreements and stuff would work. How could the U.S., though, help with solar panels or wind farms? What would be their role in what you're proposing here?
So what I'm looking at is that the United States spends billions and billions each year, along with our NATO allies, in military defense of Europe. Just this past year, we amped it up by nearly $2 billion in direct money spent to defend Europe from Russia in something called the European Defense Initiative. It's going to be about $5 billion for 2018. And this money is specifically in defense of Europe from the United States to defend Europe from Russia. In addition to the nearly $4 billion that we've already been spending, both for in money to NATO and to buy equipment for European allies, and in addition to the literally $300 billion that our NATO allies spend to defend themselves. And what I'm saying is that how about for a lot less than this annual, $50 billion that the United States and our allies are already spending for explicitly this purpose, if instead the U.S. invested, $3.5–4 billion for this, in this way, this is actually probably a more effective weapon in defense of our interests and our national security and that of our allies and most important trading partners than buying another 60 F-35s, which the Air Force is going to be buying 60 F-35 jet fighters, which are important, and I'm not discounting that. But the Air Force is going to be buying 60 F-35 jet fighters every year for the next 27 years, and they're going to spend $10 billion a year to do so. And the F-35 is great, but instead, if we spent $4 billion over only 10 years, because then we could use that money to prime the pump for a private sector development of the European international grid and the private sector clean energy development of a new energy system in Europe. And this would also return enormous benefits in terms of tens of thousands of American jobs, in terms of strengthening the economies of our most important trading partners. I mean, the benefits of this, the second-order benefits of this are enormous to our economy and that of our allies. But really, it's also an extraordinary bargain in terms of what we're already spending to defend Europe.
It's interesting. I've heard oil and gas people use the same type of argument for how we interact with the Middle East. And if we would take some of the military budget that we're using for the Middle East and offer credits or something along those lines to refineries here in the U.S. to retool themselves, we could reduce our military presence in the Middle East while allowing our refineries here stateside, to have investments and to retool themselves and to be able to process the different types of oil that are available. I haven't heard it, what you're proposing from a green energy standpoint, if you will. What would be the nations that what are those 11 nations that you mentioned earlier? Would that be where you would propose we start this out, or do you have a different way to approach this?
Well, I think it's got to be a multifaceted approach. You actually had a guest on a couple of weeks ago who was talking about the need for the electrification of Europe because so much of Europe, I think his name is Christian Ruby. Yeah. So much of Europe, their energy system, like ours, is petroleum-based or heating-based with coal or gas. And so money like this could be used to to help the smaller countries to begin to transform these systems into into more electrified networks to use electricity more, or maybe biomass more for district heating. Maybe help them begin to build an electric infrastructure for electric cars, which countries like Norway and Netherlands already are passing legislation to mandate only electric cars be sold starting in 2020, I believe. And there's a lot of different ways this can help. In some of the larger countries, they don't necessarily need our help, such as Germany and Italy, which are two of the largest natural gas importers from Russia. But with American leadership, by going to NATO, by going to the European Union and saying collectively we are going to, not just the United States, but these countries as well, dedicate even more money to doing this, then we're going to not just have our money involved, but European money as well. And when we do it together, when we do it collaboratively, it becomes a much more effective mechanism. And the smaller countries in the East, such as Hungary and Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia, and these countries that don't have the resources necessarily, we can help them build the programs they need. And they have the desire, they just really, a lot of the time, don't have the resources. And one last thing. Sometimes we don't even need necessarily to build all the capacity in one country. For example, Latvia gets all of its gas from Russia. And 44% of that gas they get from Russia is used to produce 40% of the electricity that they use. But in 2015, if you combined the wind electricity in Poland and the solar electricity produced in Germany in 2015 combined, they produced 10 times more of all the electricity that Latvia used that year. So if we worked to help improve just the international grid of all energy resources, electricity, gas flow, oil flow, among our allied countries, then we wouldn't even need to offset all of the gas coming from Russia with clean energy. We could offset some of it in some countries, and then we could allow more easily Norwegian gas or British oil to flow into places where it's needed more.
Okay, so let me just recap this because I want to ask you a devil's advocate question. The premise is, essentially, we're spending X on our military budget. We could divert some of those funds and help European nations become energy independent from Russia. Okay, that's the basic 30,000-foot principle, correct?
Yes.
Okay, now in doing that, what would happen is it would then begin to starve out the Russian economy because they're so dependent on energy exports to the European nations. Still batting 100, I think, or batting 1,000 rather. Okay,
yes.
So I guess the question would be this, but just again, devil's advocate here. If I was Vladimir Putin and I saw this, wouldn't that be a reason for me to go to war? If I said, okay, well, if the U.S. is going to starve my economy by putting out these solar panels and these wind farms and stuff like that, and eventually I know in 5, 10, 15 years, my economy is going to be gone. I can't diversify fast enough. I'm going to be in trouble. Would that be something that maybe push him over the edge and be a reason not to implement something like this?
I mean, that's a very legitimate question. I don't doubt that question. I think what needs to be taken into consideration is that Russia is already attacking the United States and our allies. Like I said, they literally threatened to eliminate Sweden. That was the words out of Putin's mouth. They tried to assassinate and execute a coup against the prime minister and the country of Montenegro just in this past year. And they already broke into and temporarily seized the grid of parts of Ireland and the UK in the past year and tried to do so for parts of the American grid. So they're already attacking us and our democratic systems. And so they already are acting against us, and we must push back and defend ourselves. And if we overnight replace the entire European grid with clean energy, then yes, that probably would not be a good thing, because overnight the entire Russian government and the economy would collapse, and you would have very serious concerns. But what I'm saying is, I mean, by definition, this isn't going to happen overnight.
Right.
And as we amplify this process, it's going to squeeze them. It's not going to squeeze them overnight, but it is going to squeeze them. And in that way, we can continue to push back more forcefully. And the Russian government's not going to collapse overnight, but it's going to have less money available to be conducting all of these, frankly, attacks on the United States and our NATO and European allies.
Well, and obviously I'm not pro-Russia in this debate. Just playing a little bit, just playing a little bit of devil's advocate there, just to see what your take on it would be. Because, as you know, when you deal with geopolitics, there's so many moving parts. It's not as simple. It's not checkers. It's chess, right? And it's actually probably like three-dimensional chess that there was on Star Trek or something like that. You know, it's a very complex game, and so it's always interesting to sit back and to look at the moving parts and to go, okay, well, if we do this, then that might happen. But anyway, so I appreciate it. I love the discussions today. We will link to this article on greentechmedia.com, where the listeners can go and read it. And where else can folks, if they want to find out more about what you got going on, or they want to follow your work, where can they find you at?
They can, I guess, Google me on and read some of the other stuff I've written. It's not as much about energy as in the past. Or they can follow me on Twitter. It's at J_Morgenstein. And we actually are going to be a co-author, not of this one, but of the next one. Elon Gluck and I were going to be writing a follow-up to get more into the details, follow-up article, to get more into the details of the economics of this capacity that we have, and then a third article about the actual security implications. Like you said, that this isn't something that we want to, even if we could, we can't just execute overnight. It's something that we want to do in a very strategic sort of way. And other people have talked about some of these vulnerabilities. The Center for Naval Analysis came out with a report earlier in the year that mentioned a lot of these issues. The Center for Naval Analysis, in fact, said that they very quickly skipped over it. But just briefly mentioned that in doing something like this, that we, I guess the United States, the West, we could drain 40 to 50 billion annually from Russia, which is 22% of the entire Russian government's budget. And Rand Corporation has written about these kind of Russian dependency on European oil. on Russian dependency on Europe to buy its oil and gas. So there's a lot of people that are starting to write about these things, but it's something that I think the United States and our government really should look into for, one, the defense of our country from our greatest threat, and two, because of all the other benefits economically, environmentally, in terms of climate change that this would bring.
Okay, Jonathan. Well, it's been a pleasure to speak to you today. Where else can people find you? Maybe you have events or books or whatever you have coming up so they can follow along after the show today.
Well, I've actually been invited to speak on this exact issue at Solar Power International in Las Vegas on September 11th. So be thrilled if people showed up to talk about it, and feel free to debate me. I'll be having taking some questions after my presentation at the event. It's September 11th in Las Vegas at Solar Power International.
Yeah, I've seen that event, and I'm kind of jealous that you're getting to go and I'm not. So have a good time, and we'll be following along and see how it goes for you, okay?
Great.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. We will link to all of that in the show notes so the listeners can go. And as the new articles come out, we will try to push those to our listeners as well so they can follow along with this interesting discussion that you're having. And we appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me.
The Global Energy Leaders podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders podcast, powered by R Squared Global.